Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal in a shocking and dramatic turn of events that no one in Port Charles could have foreseen, the long-anticipated wedding between Drew and Willow, once hailed as a celebration of love and healing, spiraled into a devastating catastrophe that left the town reeling. What was meant to be the pinnacle of a redemptive love story quickly unraveled into a harrowing spectacle of betrayal, manipulation, and long-buried secrets clawing their way back into the light. At the center of it all stood the bride herself, Willow, whose serene exterior began to fracture in the days leading up to the ceremony. Her eyes, once filled with trust and optimism, now reflected confusion, fear, and something deeper, an unconscious dread she couldn't name. Her demeanor grew more erratic by the hour. Subtle moments. Her fingers trembling as she adjusted her veil, the way she would pause mid-sentence and stare into space, or her increasingly cold and distant interactions with Drew, signaled to those closest to her that something was deeply wrong. Nina, forever protective of her daughter despite their complicated past, grew more and more concerned. She couldn't shake the feeling that Willow wasn't simply experiencing cold feet. It was as if Willow's very soul was being hollowed out. The kindness, the hope, the resilience that had defined her were fading under an invisible weight. But even Nina, with her mother's intuition, couldn't have predicted the earth-shattering revelation that was about to explode in their midst, one that would shatter illusions, derail carefully laid plans, and resurrect a ghost from the past long presumed dead. Without warning or fanfare, Britt Westbourne returned to Port Charles. Alive. Unbroken. And nothing like the version of her mourned by loved ones years ago. Her reported death had been a masterstroke of deception, an orchestrated disappearance to escape the clutches of a dangerous conspiracy linked to WSB operations gone rogue. For years, she had lived in obscurity, under an assumed identity in Europe, watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. That moment came when she discovered just how deep the rot had spread in Port Charles. When she learned that Drew Kane, once a symbol of honor, had been corrupted by power, and that Willow, someone Britt had grown to respect from a distance, was on the brink of being devoured by that very corruption. Her reunion with Jason, who had never truly stopped mourning her, was more than a shock, it was the emotional ignition to everything that followed. Britt didn't return empty-handed. She carried with her damning evidence of Drew's carefully concealed descent. Documents, encrypted messages, medical falsifications, and political manipulations all pointed to a man who had weaponized charm and credibility to bend people to his will. And at the center of his strategy was Willow, sweet, trusting Willow, whom he had ensnared through emotional dependency and subtle psychological manipulation. Britt could see it clearly. Drew had systematically isolated Willow from dissenting voices, blurred the lines between devotion and control, and positioned himself as her savior in a world where he himself was the architect of her confusion. Unable to watch another soul be devoured by the same darkness she had once escaped, Britt made the boldest move of her life. She arrived at the chapel on the day of the wedding, stepping into the aisle with a calmness that belied the fire in her heart. Guests gasped. Drew froze. Willow clutched her bouquet tighter, confused and wide-eyed. And then Britt spoke, not with malice, not with theatrical flair, but with unwavering purpose. She laid it all bare. The clandestine meetings between Drew and Nina that occurred during times he claimed to be devoted exclusively to Willow. The falsified medical records used to manipulate Willow into thinking she was unwell and needed Drew's constant supervision. The way Drew had used Portia, under duress, as a pawn to further political aspirations masked as philanthropic efforts. Every calculated move, every lie, every act of coercion was methodically exposed. Willow stood paralyzed. Her heart pounded as every memory with Drew began to contort and unravel. She turned to him, silently begging for a denial, a plea of innocence, any sliver of humanity she could hold on to. But Drew said nothing. His silence was deafening, a betrayal louder than any confession. In that moment, something within Willow snapped, not in anger, but in awakening. It was as if the spell had been broken. She realized she had been loving a version of Drew that never truly existed, clinging to the illusion of safety in a prison built on deceit. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she dropped the bouquet, turned on her heel, and walked out. Her footsteps echoing through the silent chapel. The room remained stunned, a collective breath held in disbelief. Drew, now exposed and abandoned, stood amid the ruins of his ambition. Meanwhile, Jason emerged from the crowd, calm, watchful, and finally vindicated. He had kept quiet for too long, watching the pieces fall into place, waiting for Britt to be ready to set everything in motion. Now, that time had come. In the aftermath, Willow sought out Britt. Alone in a quiet corner of Port Charles, they met not as adversaries, but as women bound by a shared understanding of survival and betrayal. Willow, her voice trembling but her mind clear, thanked Britt, not just for revealing the truth, but for saving her from a life built on lies. Britt, who had once walked away from everything she loved to protect herself, had now returned to protect someone else. The weight of that sacrifice was not lost on Willow. Meanwhile, Drew's carefully constructed world collapsed around him. With Britt's evidence, investigations were launched. Portia came forward, admitting to being manipulated and blackmailed. Nina, forced into the spotlight, confessed her past involvement, tarnishing any remaining credibility she had left in the public eye. Michael, driven by a renewed sense of justice and protective instinct for his family, pushed for legal action and began to dismantle the influence Drew had built within the Quartermain orbit. The wedding that never was became a symbol of reckoning, of awakening, and of redemption. Port Charles had witnessed many scandals, but few rivaled the impact of Britt's return and the explosive truths she carried. What began as a quiet disruption turned into a complete reset of power dynamics in the town. Britt, once seen as a lost soul, had now emerged as an unlikely hero. Jason, no longer wandering in grief, found new purpose by her side. Willow, freed from illusion, stood stronger, more independent, ready to reclaim her identity. And Drew, once celebrated, now faced the consequences of his own hubris, alone, exposed, and undone not by enemies, but by the very people he once sought to control. The shockwaves of that ruined wedding day would continue to ripple through every family, every alliance, and every secret corner of Port Charles. But through the smoke and wreckage, one thing became clear: the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back, and when it does, it changes everything. After the chaos of the wedding that never was, once the gasps had faded and the guests dispersed in stunned silence, Willow found herself wandering the back garden of the chapel, the hem of her once elegant gown dragging through the damp grass, now tattered like the life she had narrowly escaped. Her heart still raced, her hands trembled, and her chest felt like it was carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of realization. Yet, amid the emotional wreckage, one name stood clear in her mind. Britt. The woman she had once mistrusted. The woman who had returned from the dead not to reclaim a life, but to save one. Willow knew she needed to speak with her, needed to look her in the eyes and say what words could barely hold. She found Britt alone at the edge of the property, standing beneath the shadow of an old oak tree, her posture calm but guarded, her face unreadable. Willow approached slowly, her breath catching with each step. When their eyes finally met, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual recognition of everything that had just occurred, and everything that now must follow. These two women, who once circled each other warily through misunderstandings, hurt, and silence, now stood united by a truth larger than both of them. Willow's voice cracked as she began to speak, barely more than a whisper. But in her trembling words was the strength of someone who had been pulled from the brink. She thanked Britt. Not only for revealing the layers of deceit that had ensnared her but for confronting her at a moment when she most needed saving from herself. Willow confessed that she had felt something was wrong for weeks, but she had buried it, convinced herself that love meant loyalty even when her soul felt suffocated. Drew had wrapped his control in the language of protection, cloaked his manipulation in the pretense of care. And Willow, blinded by the trauma of past abandonment, had clung to the illusion like a life raft. Without Britt's return, she realized, she might have walked willingly into a gilded prison, exchanging her independence for the false comfort of someone else's dominance. She might have spent years slowly fading into a version of herself she would no longer recognize. Her gratitude wasn't just about the day being saved, it was about her life being reclaimed. She spoke of her relief, her heartbreak, her awakening. She called Britt her turning point, her mirror, the voice of defiance she had lost along the way. Britt, for her part, remained quiet for a long moment before she nodded, a softness overtaking her usual guarded demeanor. In Willow, she saw not just a victim who had escaped, but a woman who now stood at the precipice of reinvention. The bond that formed between them in that moment was not born of past affection or shared history. It was forged in the fire of truth. They didn't need to rehash old wounds. They didn't need forgiveness or justification. They only needed this, acknowledgement and solidarity. Willow walked away from that encounter not as a broken bride, but as someone reborn. The cancelled wedding was not a loss, it was liberation. The ring she never wore, the vows she never spoke, became the very markers of her freedom. And in the days that followed, she began to rebuild from the inside out. She stepped back from Drew's shadow, reclaimed her voice in community initiatives, and began advocating for others who had been quietly manipulated under the guise of love. Her growth was steady, hard-won, and profound. She had faced the darkest corners of her trust and emerged not bitter, but burning with clarity. Meanwhile, Drew Kane found himself unraveling in a far more public and irreversible way. The man who had once worn the face of virtue was now exposed as a tactician of deception. Michael, who had spent months walking the tightrope between loyalty to family and allegiance to truth, could no longer remain neutral. His patience had finally collapsed under the weight of betrayal. He publicly accused Drew of using Oscar's death to manipulate sympathy and reframe his public image, of turning every bond into a transaction, every relationship into leverage. Michael's fury was not theatrical. It was the fury of a son, a father, a protector, who had witnessed the corruption of everything sacred. Evidence mounted. Britt's files were authenticated. Portia, cornered by guilt and pressure, confessed to the coercion she had suffered under Drew's influence. Financial records surfaced, revealing dark money moved through charitable fronts, funding power plays masked as philanthropy. Nina, despite her last-minute attempt to aid Willow, was forced to face her complicity. Her silence had allowed Drew to flourish unchecked, and though her intentions were complicated, she could not escape the cost of enabling deceit. Drew's empire, crafted through backroom deals, half-truths, and emotional exploitation, began to crumble. His allies distanced themselves. The Quartermaines, once reluctantly supportive, pulled resources. Public trust evaporated. What he had built on a foundation of charisma and control now fell apart under the unforgiving light of truth. He had not only lost Willow, he had lost the illusion of himself. For a man who thrived on control, watching the world slip through his fingers was the cruelest retribution. And watching all of it unfold was Jason. He had stayed in the shadows not out of weakness, but out of strategy. He knew the truth would surface, not through force, but through conviction. And now, with Britt at his side once more, he no longer bore that burden alone. Their reunion had not been marked by fireworks or declarations, but by an unspoken understanding. They were on the same path again, not as fugitives or secret lovers, but as warriors for justice in a town teetering on moral collapse. Together, they began working quietly to restore what had been broken, helping Willow, supporting Michael, and preparing for the inevitable backlash Drew would attempt before fading into disgrace. This was not a battle of bullets or spies. This was a battle for dignity, for healing, for truth that had long been buried under years of compromise. Britt and Jason, flawed, resilient, unflinching, became the steady force Port Charles needed in a time of unraveling. As the dust settled, a new atmosphere settled over the town. Masks had fallen. Power structures had shifted. Trust was being rebuilt with careful hands. And the once predictable order of Port Charles now held space for unpredictability, for transformation. Willow stood at the forefront of that new chapter, not as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of reclamation. Britt's return had set off the spark, but it was Willow who turned it into a flame. Port Charles would never be the same. And that was exactly what it needed. In the days that followed the explosive unraveling of Drew and Willow's wedding, the fabric of Port Charles underwent a seismic shift. The shockwaves of truth that had emerged during that single afternoon continued to ripple through the town's political, social, and emotional circles, appending alliances, breaking long-standing silences, and forcing even the most powerful to confront their complicity. At the center of it all stood Willow, no longer the passive figure swept along by the currents of others' agendas, but a woman reclaiming her voice with unwavering clarity and purpose. One of Willow's first public actions following the broken engagement was to formally resign from all community roles and initiatives that had been affiliated with Drew's sponsorship and influence. These included public health outreach programs, mental wellness campaigns, and parenting workshops, platforms that Drew had used to project the illusion of benevolence while discreetly consolidating control. Willow's withdrawal sent a powerful message. She would no longer be a puppet for a man whose generosity had strings attached. But she didn't stop there. Instead of retreating into isolation, Willow emerged as a new advocate for transparency, integrity, and emotional independence. She stood before the press with her shoulders squared and her voice steady, announcing her support for Michael's initiatives focused on the protection of women and children in vulnerable domestic situations. Michael, whose own family had long been entangled in a web of secrecy and trauma, embraced Willow's endorsement. Together, they launched a coalition for family justice reform, funded independently from any political entities, aimed at supporting survivors of manipulation, coercion, and emotional abuse. Simultaneously, Willow took a bold and unexpected step by partnering with Britt. Their campaign, titled Silent Chains, focused on raising awareness around psychological manipulation in relationships, particularly the kind that masquerades as love. The campaign provided educational resources, workshops for high schools and universities, and training for medical and mental health professionals to identify early signs of emotional dependency and control. Britt, using both her medical expertise and personal experience, became a powerful figurehead for the campaign. What made the initiative revolutionary was not just the cause, but the honesty with which both women addressed their own journeys, one who had escaped an invisible prison, the other who had returned from the dead to liberate others. Meanwhile, the fallout for Drew was swift and merciless. Once a celebrated benefactor of Port Charles's medical sector, he quickly found himself the subject of intense scrutiny. Investigations unearthed falsified patient records, coerced signatures, and intimidation tactics used to redirect medical grants into his own political ambitions. Portia, who had remained silent under the pressure of blackmail, finally stepped forward with full transparency. Her testimony provided the final nail in the coffin, confirming that Drew had not only manipulated her professionally, but had threatened to expose personal family secrets if she didn't comply with his demands. As the scandal unfolded, Drew's name was stripped from the hospital's donor wall. His bank accounts were frozen pending federal investigation, and his influence within the Quartermain family began to wither. Michael, no longer restrained by familial obligation, filed a formal petition for a federal audit into Drew's financial dealings over the past 2 years. The FBI began conducting interviews, tracing wire transfers, and reviewing years of digital correspondence. The strength of Michael's actions lay not just in his determination to see justice served, but in how calculated and thorough each move was. It was as if the entire town had been holding its breath for years, waiting for this exact reckoning. And through it all, Britt remained a steady force, quiet, relentless, unshaken. Her return had once seemed like a miracle, a surreal gift of fate, but she had quickly proven that her purpose extended far beyond personal vindication. Everything she did was guided by a vow she had made to herself the moment she chose to stop running. If I'm still alive, I will not let another soul be broken by men who wear goodness like a mask. It wasn't just a promise. It was a battle cry. She had kept her word. Britt had not only saved Willow from the clutches of manipulation but had ignited a firestorm of accountability in a town that had grown far too comfortable with its secrets. Through her courage, she reminded Port Charles that truth is not always quiet, and survival is not the same as submission. Her message resounded in every woman who stepped forward, in every child protected by the new community programs, and in every line of legislation that began forming as a result of silent chains. Drew, once confident in his ability to cloak his ambition behind charity and calm demeanor, had underestimated the power of raw truth. Especially when wielded by someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He had counted on the silence of victims, the paralysis of fear, and the apathy of bystanders. But Port Charles was no longer a town that turned away. With Britt's return, it had remembered its spine. The courthouse steps, once a place of hushed media presence, now became a daily stage for the evolution of accountability. Protesters gathered with signs supporting Willow and Britt. Survivors of emotional abuse began to share their stories anonymously through campaign letters and local op-eds. Therapists volunteered to join the campaign's hotline services. Law students at Port Charles University began organizing symposiums around ethical reform in medicine and politics.